So this next session is about educating our professionals about animal welfare. And I'm losing the microphone, so if I just start shouting, go with it. I have an amazing panel with me this afternoon, and I'm going to ask each one of them to spend up to 5 minutes sharing the ideas that they think are critical, the top maybe 3 or 5 pieces that go into providing training to professionals about animal welfare, and then having the remaining part of the time for this session for audience questions and panel discussion. So if I could start and ask Dr. Heather Bacon, who's the Veterinary Welfare Education and Outreach Manager for the University of Edinburgh, to start us off, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, I have a fairly, I hope, global appreciation of some of the challenges faced in animal welfare in zoos and sanctuaries and animal welfare NGOs around the world. I spend a lot of my time working in low to middle income nations, but I also work with some excellent zoos in the Western world. And I think animal welfare issues present challenges to the global zoo community because of that diversity. There are so many varying ethical viewpoints, as we've heard already today. And reaching a common ethical position can be a real challenge. Zoos can absolutely be institutions for the conservation of nature, but in some cases, zoos can also be active consumers of wildlife. So there isn't even really a common definition of what zoos are, never mind what animal welfare is, as we've already heard. We've heard a lot about ethics today, and the ethical decisions that we make will influence our actions, and our actions will influence the welfare of the animals that we are responsible for. For example, by limiting reproduction, we may deprive animals of important social and maternal behaviours. We may also avoid the uncomfortable decisions associated with population management euthanasia. Fundamentally, from an animal welfare point of view, we need to ask whether these ethical decisions that we make are making tangible improvements to the experience of the animals that we're responsible for, or are they just decisions that we're making to make us feel better about what we're doing? So, as has already been said, the good intentions don't always lead to good animal welfare outcomes. Traditionally in zoos, we've focused very much on this human agenda. We focus very much on what we provide, on what we do, on what we think, on what we feel. And whilst those discussions are important, they're not animal welfare. Animal welfare is about the subjective experience of that animal and about how that animal feels. Of course, from an educational point of view, what we're interested in is how we can improve animal welfare through influencing the attitudes, the knowledge, and the actions of the humans who are responsible for animals. And, let's be under no illusions, we are responsible for everything that our zoo animals have access to. We're responsible for all of the resources that we provide for them. We're responsible for their transfer. We're responsible for who they have sex with. We're responsible for every single decision that those animals experience, every single experience those animals have. And so that's a huge area of responsibility, and we know the human-animal relationship is of fundamental importance to zoo animals. However, traditionally, we have focused very much on this resource provision approach, and it can be very difficult from a psychological point of view to accept that perhaps what we have been doing is not great and that we need to change what we're doing. Change is a really difficult psychological shift for humans. In terms of education, trying to change human behaviour and promote positive human-animal relationships, and that's not just about what makes the keeper feel good, it's about what makes the animal feel good as well, is very, very difficult. In education, we focus a lot on knowledge transfer. And knowledge transfer is just not good enough. We can impart information, but knowing something is not the same as empowering somebody to be able to do that. What works in one country or in one institution may not work in another country or another institution. There will be institutional barriers. I work in zoos, for example, where keepers perhaps don't even read or write. So having an animal welfare assessment protocol or written instructions is not going to work. Similarly, I also work in institutions that are excellent and have a very proactive approach to animal welfare. And so trying to balance educational strategies across that spectrum is a huge challenge. Effective education has to be tailored to the individual organisation, the individual culture, the individual problems that are faced. And it has to be about empowerment and empowering people to develop their own solutions to the problems that they face in their daily lives. Because education never stops, and you can only teach people to a certain level. And then once you've reached that level, you need to be able to also be able to deal with new challenges and new problems and new issues that will arise in the future. So it's much more about self-directed skill acquisition, self-directed knowledge acquisition, self-directed attitude shift than it is about simply knowledge transfer. I think traditionally, in terms of education, we perhaps haven't been as active as we could be. Certainly in the UK, our animal welfare and behaviour teaching for our zookeeper diploma is something that we're currently revising to try and improve. And I would hope that with the range of expertise in the room that we would be able to focus on empowering and improving animal welfare, not just in zoo visitors, but also within zoo professionals.
Thank you, Heather. Next, we're going to hear from Sabrina Brando, who is an animal welfare and behavior consultant and researcher, running the firm Animal Concepts that does actually a ton of training when it comes to animal welfare all over the world.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm very glad we have lots of different ideas within this panel, because of course 3 to 5 minutes is a very short time when you try to think about, okay, so what are the critical points of thinking about educating zoo professionals? So one of the things that I notice in working around, especially Europe, but also other places, is that because the profession isn't protected. So anyone can really become a zoo care professional. And I think this is one of the points that I find perhaps something that could need a lot of attention, is to see how can we, just like if you would be a lawyer or work in a kindergarten, there should, I think, be some type of protection to the profession, as in making sure that people who come in this profession have a certain education. So if I look at the zookeepers in the Netherlands, where I'm from, we have a few zookeeper schools, and in those curriculum, a lot of them, as has been mentioned earlier, a lot of it is already based also on the agricultural background. So a lot of it is still revolving around health, cleaning, and feeding. But very little of the curriculum is actually looking at welfare from a broader perspective, a holistic perspective, considering the physical and psychological needs of animals. So one of the things that I think is important is that we look at how can we make this profession a protected profession that is also more professionalized, in the sense of having a degree that is specifically also targeted to wild animal welfare and care. I think it's great. I'm a psychologist by training, but I don't necessarily know, therefore, how to take care of zoo animals. So I think it's great we see a shift in zoos looking at hiring people with either a zoo caretaker degree or a university degree of some sort. But still, those degrees don't make you a good animal welfare and care professional. So I think, if we're thinking about training people, perhaps this is a point where we could move into and see, could we not have degrees? And I think there is some movement towards this that is really specifically targeted to caring for wild animals and looking at their welfare. One of the other points, of course, that I think working as a professional interested in science, but also how do we translate that science and into practical work on a day-to-day basis, is how do we then translate that and use the information that comes out of cognition research or physiology research and feed that into caring for animals and looking at their welfare. So that's another point that I think when it comes to training people, how could we facilitate that better, building those bridges between science and the practice. And when I think about practice and training people, one of the things that we run into often as well is that people might want to do a lot of things for the animals, but they might not have actually the practical skills. And they're constantly waiting for the technical staff within the zoo to actually facilitate some of the changes that they want to make within the exhibits, or to facilitate maybe opportunities for animals. So some of the training is not just, I think, the science or the theory that's related to animal welfare, but it's also about practical skills, giving people practical skills on a day-to-day basis, or also to collaborate with others that might have those skills that we don't have, which I don't see enough of, unfortunately. One of the other points that I also really like is the transfer of success stories of looking at animals and how we can improve their welfare by sharing from what zoo professionals see between other zoo professionals. So I collaborate regularly with the Copenhagen Zoo and on all kinds of seminars. And I have 3 stories that I would like to share with you when we're thinking about, so how do we train people to think about welfare? One of them was about taking care of the guinea pigs that are used as animals in outreach programs. And the caretaker said, well, why don't we ask these guinea pigs to just decide for themselves whether they want to participate in these programs or not, and hop into this crate. If they do so, we reinforce them for it, and then they interact with the public. And now we can see this practice spreading around facilities in Europe, because people see, okay, guinea pigs get a choice whether they want to be in these programs or not. And we can, improve their welfare by, these practical stories. So another one in the Copenhagen Zoo, they saw that the animals that they were removing from a sea lion pup that was removed from the female started calling all the time. And then the next time a pup died, they let the pup in the exhibit, and they were talking to the public until the female said goodbye to the pup and left the pup, and then removed the pup. Now they're using this when this happens, they're using this as a point to show people, look, this is what we're trying to do, and to improve the welfare of the animals, to say goodbye in difficult periods. Yeah. So, and I think those stories, when we share them more and more, can also help when we're training zoo professionals to think about welfare from very specific points to science to very practical applications on a daily basis.
Next, we'll hear from Sally Binding, who's the Animal Welfare Training Officer for the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums.
Thank you very much. And firstly, I apologise for my voice. I think I brought the plague across the ocean with me, so I do apologise. So I represent the Academy, which is EASA's training and development arm. We work with zoos across Europe and the Middle East, developing animal welfare courses, all areas of animal care, from breeding, breeding program, for example, conservation, etc. And I manage the animal welfare-based courses. Like Heather, I see quite a spectrum of zoos. I spend a lot of time working with EASA's mentor scheme. We have a system where we pair with the developing zoos, the progressive zoos pair with the developing zoos, and guide them in all aspects of their development, which includes welfare, which is where I step in. So the first thing to say is that in the spirit of optimism, I think we'll all agree that when it comes to welfare, it's infiltrating every part of our animal management to a greater or lesser degree at the moment, and more than it ever has done. So I think we should be optimistic about the way that welfare is moving, even if we're not all happy about the speed that it's going. However, the main challenges that I come across in the developing zoos see it in two aspects, really. The first one, and focusing on the developing zoos, is it's either lack of money to actually engage in training courses. As you see here, we're a very select bunch of people, and just by the mere notion that we're here means that there is that finance there to bring us here, to come together to talk about welfare and progress our education. Many zoos I work with don't have the funds to do that. Either that or they don't have the opportunity to. Language barriers, for example, as Heather said again, a lot of the staff I work with, I work very closely with translators. So they don't speak English. They wouldn't have access to the latest evidence-based research, for example. They wouldn't be able to attend a training course outside of the ones, for example, that we might deliver that's in their own language. Or they have the money, they may have the language skills or the resources, but there's a lack of recognition at a higher management level that the importance of training. So that's where you need to hit management level and go, actually, this needs to be incorporated into your budget. This is important. The other main challenges that I come across are often there is a disconnect at the many levels of a zoo or aquarium. And so, for example, you've got the keeper level, or the kind of the more applied staff, so the keeper, maybe the nutritionist, for example, the education staff. Then you've got the management level, and in many zoos, there's also that municipality level. And for example, at many of the zoos that I work with, a lot of the decisions are made at a municipality level. So if they're having anything redesigned, if they're having animals brought in or taking out, or the development of the zoo is at a municipality level, and it's often driven by the council members or the zoo inspectors, and often it's of a much greater economic drive, and their objectives for the zoo are very different to actually the zoo staff and what the zoo want for the staff. So I try and work, and I think a big challenge is building that bridge between the different levels so that you're not just teaching welfare to one level and it stays nicely enclosed in its box. So you're not teaching it to management, but the actual zoo staff don't have any idea how to interpret this information, or you're not just having zoo staff taught, but then they've got no guidance and no support from higher up as to how to actually implement that it doesn't get lost in just general day-to-day ad hoc process, and you actually teach the zoo as a whole how to integrate welfare into their daily practices. So it goes into protocol, it goes into what's expected, it's considered as important as cleaning and feeding. So they're the main challenges that I come across. The other one to highlight as well is that often a little information can be more dangerous than no information at all. And again, I spend a lot of time almost re-educating on mantras that have sort of drip-fed through the system, because there isn't proper access to education and training materials. So, for example, breeding is good for welfare, in inverted commas, which, as we know, is not that cut and dry. It's not that black and white, and it's an arbitrary statement. It doesn't mean anything. The other one is the role that cortisol plays in welfare, the role of stress and how we interpret these results. So often there's a lot of having a thing waved to me. Often there is a lot of miseducation that comes through the system, so it's trying to address those as well. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, Cindy Milburn, who is the Director of Outreach and Policy Development for the International Fund for Animal Welfare.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the organisers for putting this meeting together. I've already learned a huge amount today, and I've actually changed what I was going to say, partly as a result of all the things I've heard. But one of the things that I wanted to start off with is that animal welfare, as we've heard, is a very kind of complex issue, and we make many assumptions about animal welfare from our own perspectives without realizing that we're making the assumptions. And our CEO, was it about 3 years ago, felt that, never mind everyone else learning about animal welfare, we ought to make certain everyone in the International Fund for Animal Welfare learned about animal welfare. And so we asked Edinburgh University if they would help create a course for us on animal welfare that it was an online, or is an online course, it's ongoing, because we have offices in China, in Russia, in Australia, in Canada, many offices in Europe, United States, 2 offices in Africa. And it was very obvious to us that we all in our heads felt something different and thought something different about animal welfare. And one of the things that I learned along the way, I've worked in animal welfare for 40 years, and I started off in education. I was head of education for the RSPCA in the UK, long before the science of animal welfare had ever been created. And so at that time, it was all personal opinion. But one of the most enlightening things that I learned was from Professor Fraser, when I suddenly had this dawning realization that there are different perspectives on animal welfare. And I would say that IFAW's overriding perspective is a natural life. You know, we've learned about health, we've heard about feelings. And if your organization has a view that a natural life is the most important of those three, it makes a fundamental difference to the way you approach things. And as we're an organization that has always worked for wildlife welfare, we needed to articulate to our staff that was key for us. And so we think penguins should be in the wild. In fact, we think all wild animals should be in the wild. That's our position statement. And it's very clear. But that doesn't mean that we don't work with people with opposing views. We always have done. We've had tremendous support from zoos since 1969 when our organisation was launched. And zoo professionals, so for instance with the Treasure Oil spill that we've already heard in 2000, IFAW, SANCOB and the IBRRC oversaw the cleaning of 20,000 penguins over a 3-month period, and 90% of them were successfully released in the wild. And a year later, there were more penguins, African penguins, on Robben Island than there had been the previous year, because they were so well looked after and they went back very well fed. But we could never have done if it hadn't been for Disney, for Taronga Zoo, for the AZA, EASA, and for Detroit Zoo. In fact, we had 1,000 volunteers working for us every day, 1,000 volunteers. And it was a huge group effort. And, you know, it broke down so many barriers between all the animal welfare groups and the zoo professionals. And that was a kind of real lesson to me. And I think when I started off, I was probably like many, 20-year-old animal people who basically viewed zoos with some suspicion. But that's long since passed. But having said that, we do need to be very, very open and listen to each other. And we need to be prepared to have this willing suspension of disbelief. And I think that coming from the UK and being quite startled by our country's decision to leave the European Union, as were at least half the country very startled by that. And I guess you've also had an election here. There were people who were very surprised, and you suddenly realised that you thought you knew what the prevailing view was in the country. And I think these things are lessons to us. We've got to listen to people who we don't think hold our own view. Those are the people, in a way, we've got to listen to the most. Because if we can take a step back, if we can find common ground, we can make a huge, huge difference. But going back to education, there are various things that I've heard today that I think are critically important. First of all, language is critically important. But, we've got to be precise, but we mustn't be too pedantic about it. Because we change the use of language, people have different understandings of it. But it is important. It does impact what other people think we're saying. I've heard, yes, I agree, we need to challenge positions and not people. We really need to seek common ground. We need to start with the end in mind. And we have to accept we can provide a better life, but perhaps not a good life for wild animals in captivity, or it's hard to provide a good life, perhaps sometimes we can. These should all be part and parcel of our education programs, so that we don't end up with people who think they know about animal welfare. It's very complex. And also, education is very complex. Humane education is very complex. When I started, I had no idea about things like cognitive dissonance. I thought you just told people what the truth was and they would do the right thing. I think many of us start off very naively. People say what they think, but they don't do what they say they believe in. That's a fact. We have this confirmation bias. Very easy now on the internet to find the views that resonate with our own, and then just kind of, surround ourselves in this echo chamber of nonsense sometimes, but we believe it, and we think everyone else should believe it. Compassion fatigue, we've heard about compassion fatigue. I'm sure all of us in the movement have experienced it at times when you simply just wonder how you can go on. How many setbacks can you continue to have? And then there's another concept, which is the collapse of compassion, which I think is even more worrying, where people think that the enormity of something is so great that they shift their moral compass to accept what previously they didn't accept as okay. And that is this was discovered when people were faced with human disasters. And people are much more likely to give money to an individual in distress than when there are thousands and thousands of people in distress, because at that point they think that there's nothing they can do about it. So we have to be aware of all these things. It's not as simple as just giving people the facts and expecting them to behave in the right way. Education is very, very complex. And again, we have to encourage people to understand their own biases. And it's not that it's right necessarily or wrong to think that wild animals should live in the wild and naturalness is more important than health or even feelings, because living in the wild is tough. But if you know that that's how you think, or that's how your organization thinks, at least then you know when you're talking to someone with a completely different perspective, it's not that they're wrong, but it's going to be hard for you to have these discussions if you don't understand your different approaches. Okay, so I'm going to finish now. So I think one of the things, if I can say, in terms of what I've learned here about the importance of education to zoo professionals and aquarium professionals, first of all, our presence here is our commitment. We need to work together. If we're working together, I believe we're an unstoppable force, and we need that. Time's running out. It's run out in many cases. But if we just have to keep our ears open and maybe close our mouths a bit and just listen and see if we can find common ground. Thank you. Thank you.
So as I wait to see if there's any additional questions making their way to the stage, I wanted to just share a thought here. And it's that, hello. I seem to have a lot of trouble with microphones. We have different people coming from different organizations, different countries, all faced with some similar challenges when it comes to talking about animal welfare and providing education and training for not just the public, certainly, but for the people who are working daily with animals. And I think it also points out a lot of opportunities that I think are across borders and across situations. And I think that that's an incredible thing. One of the things that I've been very happy to see over the last number of years is the new courses, the new workshops, the new training opportunities that are cropping up in different countries from different organizations, because it's really important to make sure that we have access to information. We have access not only to what we know or think we know right now, but continuing to evolve that knowledge is incredibly important. I'll tell you that for the last 5 years, we've been conducting workshops right here at the Detroit Zoo where people from all over the world join us for 5 days. And one of the major areas of focus that we have is really thinking about the world from the perspective of the animal. And so it's not just about helping keepers and managers and other animal behavior professionals to understand how to study welfare. It's really thinking about, if you're an animal living in a world created by people, what is that experience like? And if we were able to be them, as hard as that might be, since I don't know that I could walk in any of your shoes, but what would that world be like, and how might we make it different in order to improve their situation? So it is something that I think we need to think about more, and sometimes we forget when we are taking care of animals how that impacts their welfare. So I have a couple of questions here. One, and this is certainly at the root of when we're providing training to animal caregivers and zookeepers, et cetera. What are we training them to do? And the question is, are keepers trained to recognize despair, which is a profound sadness based upon the condition of captivity itself, regardless of the kinds of enhancements we might be able to make. Are there ways in which we are able to point out maybe there are situations that just don't lend themselves to enhancements? It's a tough one. Thanks.
I think, as the previous session discussed, recognizing any specific emotional state in an animal can be hugely challenging. I think we probably all agree that animals have feelings and have the capacity to experience a range of different emotional states. What that experience is like for an individual is very difficult to understand. I know what my pain experience is. I know what my sad experience is. I know what my joy experience is. But I don't know what Cindy's is. I'm assuming it's probably quite similar. And so applying that across other species is hugely challenging. I think, again, just to kind of reiterate what was mentioned in the last session, I think one of the challenges that I face is that often the staff that work in zoos know a lot about their animal in that environment, but they don't know a lot about that animal and its natural ecology, its ethology and its natural behaviours, its internal motivations, its evolutionary drives and motivations, and how to accommodate those things. And so we often see quite simplistic husbandry strategies being used to treat problems that are much more profound and complex than that. So problems like abnormal repetitive behaviours are not going to be solved with a puzzle feeder. It's not necessarily an enrichment issue. And I think in zoos quite often we haven't given our keeping staff and our middle management staff enough training and understanding of the complexity and importance of motivation, learning theory, and normal ethology of the species that we house. They only understand those animals within that specific environment. And what's normal in an artificial environment is not necessarily normal. So I think sometimes we do need to go back to nature a little bit.
Great. Did anyone else want to offer any additional thoughts to that one?
I think the only thing that I would say about when we talk about affective states and feelings and emotional aspects with regards to zoos, again, I do think it's very much you pick your battles and you know your audience very well. Some zoos I work with, we can talk about that. We can look at the research. We would discuss welfare at a lot higher level. However, some of the zoos I work at, if you start talking about that sort of thing, you do lose your audience, and you have to be really careful. And you have to, I personally have a bit of an internal battle because I'm very much in the sort of feeling school as well, and I want to get this across. But you will lose people, and if you lose them on that aspect, you do lose them on some of the more basic welfare aspects. That if you targeted teaching them about those things, you're more likely to get a positive outcome. So, yeah, I think that we can do, but I definitely think you're very careful as to who you're speaking to about it, and if actually you're at a zoo where you can, as Heather said, look at more sort of the ethological aspects, and that's something that they will get on board with, then that's what you focus on. You have a limited amount of time, and you're more likely to have success and longevity of success as well.
Yes, so for my master thesis, I spent some time actually interviewing caregivers on how they evaluate animal welfare, and the first questions were really about positive welfare indicators and what they saw as negative welfare indicators, and how they assess the animals in the morning. And only about 6 questions down, and they were really freely talking about the sounds that the animals were making and the faces that the animals were making and the body positions and all these aspects, and that the animals were happy and curious and so on. And then only some questions down, I actually asked about whether they thought animals had emotions and how they expressed them, and could they say a little bit more about it. And about half of the interviews actually, became quite reluctant to speak about it, even though in all the other questions before, they were very free about speaking about it, because, and many started with, I don't want to be anthropomorphic, but, so it was quite interesting also to see that, we might want to pay more attention or start to discuss it more freely, and also really think about, how do we use anthropomorphism or critical anthropomorphism, as Professor Gordon Burghardt has long ago already described. So, and for people not to feel that they cannot speak about animal emotions. So I think there's a point there that perhaps, at least that sprang out really in my thesis, that people are conscious about it and they know animals experience emotions, but then to talk about it, there's still a big taboo about it.
Great. And so a question, do we have more questions in the audience? Oh, excellent. Your handwriting is terrible, Mark. I've seen it. It's true. If I could have one of the folks grab the question from Mark, please. Thank you so much. I definitely won't be able to read it. Mark, shout it out. Go ahead.
Oh, great. I can't read it either. No. So I think what Heather said is really extremely important, and I know personally how you feel about animals. But I think we overestimate how difficult it is to assess certain situations like extreme joy or extreme despair, as Stephen would say. So it's not normal for animals to pace back and forth, okay? I mean, I studied wolves, I studied coyotes for years in the wild. They don't pace back and forth that way. They spend a lot of time relaxing, looking around, and it's these periods of inactivity when they're picking up a lot of information about other animals, what's going on around them in their group, maybe in other groups, whether they're predators or prey. So while we can't always be perfect, and I find that to be the lamest excuse that people use for assessing other minds. They'll say, well, we don't really know this. Well, we do know a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. So, for example, if you live with a dog and the dog is pacing all over every day and barking and whimpering, you go to a veterinarian or to a trainer, okay? So, on the one hand, I think we don't have perfect access into the minds and the hearts and the emotions of other animals, but I think we need to give ourselves more credit for knowing when an animal is in deep despair and really, in some ways, not rehabilitatable, or when an animal is just, an individual is just as happy as can be. But, I mean, the other minds games, I think, are dangerous in terms of overlooking the obvious things of when animals are in despair. And one of the easiest things to do, because I dogs a lot, is when you have an animal who's in despair like a dog, you might just simply take them to a dog park. You might simply put them in another situation. So I just wanted to say that because this argument is 100 years old. We don't know the other minds, but we do.
I would absolutely agree with you that I think the precautionary principle is something that we should all be advocating, and I guess what I was trying to say, probably not very clearly, is that I don't think we should necessarily, or my understanding of the session is we're not necessarily focusing on specific emotions and how you recognise those. It's much more about how do we ensure a minimum standard of care through effective zookeeper training. And as Sally said, I think there is a cohort of people who will disconnect from that argument, as valid as it may be. Not everybody will engage with that. And so what I find useful is looking much more at ethology and natural behaviours, and just what you said about animals will rest in the wild and what kinds of behaviours do they engage with that are normal behaviours, what kind of life strategies are important to them, what motivations are important to them, what's their evolutionarily driven behaviours, and how do we accommodate those. And looking much more holistically at the whole behavioural repertoire as being something that particularly our keeping staff need to be familiar with, that those normal behaviours and that normal repertoire, rather than just what our animals do within the zoo environment. I think I often meet keeping staff who are very familiar with their own animals in that context, but they've got very little understanding of the animal's natural ecology, its natural daily routines, its natural and evolutionary driven by behaviours. And it's often frustration of those evolutionary drives and motivations that create some of the abnormal repetitive behaviours that we see as being problematic in captivity.
One suggestion I was going to make this morning is if you're responsible for polar bears, and I really mean this, then you go out and you spend a certain number of hours watching wild polar bears, or at least films of them, for example. Because that's the only way to gain that knowledge. Anyway.
Thank you, Mark. And so as we are coming to the end of this particular session, and as we in the audience have leaders of zoos, aquariums, and regional associations from all over the world, I would love to get, let's call it a soundbite from each one of you. The most important thing you would like for them to walk away with and bring back to their organizations when it comes to training their staff.
I would say ensuring that there is information flow at all levels, and that welfare is incorporated into, thinking as I'm speaking, incorporated into the actual daily running of your zoos, and ensuring that it's not isolated into different sectors and everybody's working together to actually get it happening, and we're not all just talking about it. And ensuring that it's involved, its protocols, the systems, and it's part of running, not just this ad hoc thing we do if there's time afterwards.
Yes. What she said. Yes, no, absolutely. And I really love science and building. And so I think, let's see, maybe building bridges between, the science that we have available already and trying to feed that into our husbandry manuals, really working together in translating that information so it gets out on a practical level that benefits the animals. So how can we translate information into practical welfare applications on the ground for the animals and the care staff, of course?
Mine would be pretty similar to Sally's, really, is just speak to your staff. As part of my research, I've interviewed a lot of staff, zoo staff from across the European Union specifically, but also across Asia. And universally, all the zoo directors tell me is that their staff aren't motivated about animal welfare. They just want to do their jobs 8 till 6, and then they want to go home. They can't get them to do extra work. Enrichment and behavioural management is extra work, and their staff aren't interested. When I speak to the keepers, what they tell me is they get no support from the management, there's no resource provision, there's no time, they don't have enough access to the facilities to be able to provide what they want for the animals that they look after. These are staff within the same zoo. The staff at the bottom are blaming the guys at the top are blaming the guys at the bottom, and I can guarantee you they never speak to each other. So having that information flow, knowing your staff is really important.
Following on from that, I think it's just to remind every single person who works in a zoo that when you take a wild animal and put it in captivity and you've created that dependency, as we heard about today, then animal welfare, the very best you can offer, is a moral imperative. Everything has to be in the service of those animals, and that everyone in the zoo should understand that, including the board. So I would recommend that every zoo has a training program for every single person in the zoo.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.